What is going on, y'all? I'm KM Best. Marvel Snap's newest OTA changes just dropped. Let's take a look and talk about what they might do to the metagame, and at the end, I have some deck lists for the newly changed cards. Now, since these are OTA changes, keep in mind that they are changes to the numbers on the card and not the overall functionality of a card. So Spider-Man going from a 4-cost 3-power card to a 5-cost 4-power card, but he is keeping the same ability. Now, Spider-Man's nerf seems to be targeted at the High Evolutionary lockdown decks, which would rely on playing Spider-Man on turn 5 in order to float energy to increase power with Misty Knight and Sunspot and Hulk, and decrease opposing power with Cyclops. Now that Spider-Man costs 5, you are much more hard-pressed to actually play him while soaking energy. You can maybe do it if you get the super flow, but that's pretty much it in terms of how that is going to play out in those High Evolutionary lockdown decks. So I know one thing people have been talking about is just how big the Hulk is and how scary High Evolutionary Hulk is, and this Spider-Man change is actually a stealth nerf to that Hulk, because now that's -2 power on the Hulk if you're playing this guy on 5. One worry I do have is this doesn't really differentiate him from his partner in crime, I suppose, Professor X, and I think that's unfortunately just something we're going to have to deal with, because Spider-Man at 4 with High Evolutionary was just too strong of a play on turn 5, and I think this is a pretty deserved nerf. And, you know, sometimes when you end up in one of the most powerful decks in the game, you are going to see nerfs, and it's unfortunate that it happened during Spider-Verse season, but the nerf bat has come for Peter Parker. Beast keeping his same ability, going from 2-cost 2 power to 3-cost 4 power. I think this might be my most controversial take of this video. I don't really think this is a significant nerf. I'm still going to play it in the bounce lists. What it does do, though, is make the bounce lists have to play significantly more linear game plans. Like, for example, if you look at the Equinox list that was used to counterplay Wave, it included Iron Man, it included Super Skrull. I think we're a lot more hard-pressed to actually include those cards now. Although, you know, it's possible we can still maybe get away with it. It's just, we really have to be playing our cards early in order to be beasting on 4 with a 1-cost card, or setting up the beast a lot more consistently. Now, that said, I already play to set up beasts a lot, because there's not a lot of Cosmo in the metagame right now, and there's actually very little downside to just setting up a good beast lane a lot of the time. Now, if Cosmo comes back in force, this becomes a much more significant change, because then you're going to really want to keep your beast options open until the minute you want to commit, and that's the kind of situation in which this change could really actually hurt the deck. For now, though, I think, you know, I do float some energy some of the times on those middle turns, turn 4, turn 5. I have been known to float energy on those turns, and I don't mind getting extra power in the trade-off. I just think it'll require a little bit more strategic gameplay, and I think maybe a little bit more linear deck building. I've been seeing a lot of builds of bounce that have 6 1-cost cards in it now to accommodate Iron Fist and Human Torch, and I don't really think that's a bad idea. If Beast is going to cost 3 and give you 4, I'm kind of into getting more low to the ground and seeing what that does for the deck. The Hood gaining an additional bit of negative power, going from -2 to -3, and I don't really get this change, because you already deck build to get rid of the Hood. That is the fundamental thing that every deck that plays the Hood is sort of built to do, is minimize his downside of being -3, right? So you are already playing him in decks with Deathlock and Killmonger and Carnage, or decks with Bast and Beast and Falcon. That's what you do with the card. And that's sort of what the card seems intended to do. So what increasing the downside does, I don't really get, because the whole point of the card is you mitigate the downside ever happening to you. So I guess this is a little bit of a nerf, but it just feels like something that isn't super meaningful. One place where it could be really meaningful, though, is in the bounce decks ordering. What I mean by that is, a lot of the time you struggle with, you know, okay, you have a Hood on the board, you have a Bast in the hand, you have some other 1-cost cards in the board. How do you create a situation where the Hood goes back to your hand, but the demon that the hood gave you does not get basted when you play the bast, because you want the bast to hit the hood, but you don't want the bast to hit the demon. You're sending all your 1-cost cards back to your hand with a falcon or a beast or something, and you have to really like do a bunch of figuring out of situations like that. I think the increased cost to beast and the increased downside of the hood make those situations a lot harder to navigate now. And that is, I think, a reasonable tone down of the bounce deck. I just don't know if it's going to erase it entirely. I highly doubt that it will erase a deck with that kind of power ceiling and that kind of explosive ability. Rogue is gaining an additional point of power, going from a 3-1 to a 3-2. Now, Rogue is a card that was sort of left behind when Enchantress got buffed, first to a 4-6 and then toned down a little bit to a 4-5, but they fill similar roles in decks, and it's hard to find situations where Rogue is the preferable option, especially in terms of just including it in a list. Generally speaking, it's easier to splash Enchantress in because she has a good body, because she has synergy with Zabu, which you may already be running. It's easier to get her in a list than it is to get Rogue in a list. Rogue obviously has upside in Silver Surfer lists, being that she costs 3, but it's a lot harder to splash a Silver Surfer package into your deck because Silver Surfer wants you to play only 3-cost cards. It's a lot easier to splash a Zabu package into your deck because that's Zabu and like maybe 3 or 4 4-cost cards. It's a lot easier to get that into deck building than it is to get Silver Surfer in, so Rogue ends up as part of this much clunkier package that is really only doing its one singular thing. Now, I'm not sure how fair that is to Rogue, so I'm very happy with the buff that she got. I think she's a really unique card, and I think especially with High Evolutionary decks running around, the fact that she costs 3 instead of 4 could really matter. 1 energy floating is a huge deal in those decks. It's extra power on the Hulk, Sunspot, Misty Knight, extra negative procs on the Cyclops. Like, this is a spot where she could actually shine. I hope people take another look at her because I think she's especially good as a counter to Luke Cage. Next up is Medusa, and hey, wait, that's the same card. Gotta look closer for this one. So it turns out OTAs can change the numbers on cards, not just energy and cost, but the numbers in their effects as well. So Medusa here now goes from gaining 2 power when played on the middle lane to gaining 3 power when played on the middle lane. This makes her a much more attractive option for players who are playing on a budget. Early game players will actually want to play Medusa a decent amount of the time now, and I do wonder if she could maybe see some play in decks that are just built to like get ahead. But those decks have really taken a downturn after, you know, the leader change. There are still Doomwave decks. I don't know if they would prefer her over something like Jeff or even Lizard, but I do think this kind of maybe can get her into the conversation. Right now, I would have her a little bit lower down the list than those two, but I do think this can get her into the conversation of, you know, this is a 2-cost card that can give you 5 power. That's a really good thing to have. The downsides are pretty significant. You know, sometimes it's just going to be a 2-cost card that gives you 2 power if you can't play it on the middle lane, but how many times is that actually going to happen? The issue is she's not going to be good in decks that want to deploy her super late, right? So Lizard was often played in Sarah lists because, you know, Killmonger could mitigate the downside, but that's because you want to be able to choose where your power goes late in the game, right? Medusa is not going to give you that utility. You're not going to be able to choose where your power goes if you're playing Medusa. She's going to be a 2-5 in the middle lane or 2-2 elsewhere. That's a little bit flexible, but I think it moves her closer to Star-Lord than it moves her closer to Lizard and Jeff. In terms of decks after the changes, I still expect to be playing this list. I actually kind of wonder if we can't get even lower to the ground to just really just add even more power to the board. I've seen people running like a Vulture, Ghost Spider, Human Torch, Invisible Woman, Vulture kind of thing. I said Invisible Woman there. I meant Iron Fist. My bad. I'm not editing that out. You can't make me. So the interesting thing that this deck does is explode for a ton of power, and I don't think that changes. I just don't think that these changes do anything to make this deck actually that much worse. The power ceiling on it is still so astronomical. It's still going to be a deck that puts out so much power on turn 6 if it's not countered. And Spider-Man just got a nerf, and that was actually one of the main things that was like preventing this deck from being turbo elite, Wave, of course, being the other one. But if Spider-Man ends up getting nerfed and people start playing less Spider-Man and they see Bounce getting nerfed and they're going to be like, okay, I can cut Wave. If they cut Wave and they cut Spider-Man, this deck is still going to farm them. That's just how it is. The Evo control decks are faced with a bit of a quandary. What exactly should their reaction be to this announcement of the Spider-Man change, right? So there are two real directions it can go. The first, I think, is absolutely nothing changes. Everything stays the same. We prefer Spider-Man over Professor X as a 5-cost card anyway. He's a little bit bigger, and he works with our Doctor Doom. So nothing changes at all, right? The second thing that could happen is everything changes, and we want to get a lot heavier and a lot less reliant on Hulk and include a lot more of just the good High Evolutionary cards, Thing, Abomination, and use those as our major threats to start locking things down. It's not like Spider-Man on turn 5 is going to get worse, it just gets less synergy with our early game. So if we got heavier and like dropped a little bit of our early game 1-cost soaking theme and added things like, you know, Thing, Abomination, just big units that we can maybe play under cost, that might be another direction this deck can go. One situation that I think Rogue has some real upside in is in High Evolutionary mirrors, where High Evolutionary players have been really including Luke Cage, because otherwise it's pretty hard to get an edge on those mirrors if you don't. So Rogue is one way to get an edge on the people trying to get an edge on you. Rather than Enchantressing their Luke Cage, which costs 4, you can Rogue it, which costs 3, letting you soak a little bit of energy, your Hulk gets bigger, and you get their Luke Cage. So this is, I think, the major use case that I see for Rogue. She also covers you in, like, some other situations, like, you know, this deck otherwise wouldn't have an answer to something like an Iron Man or a Patriot, and she can make those decks a little bit weaker by stealing one of those at the very least. Even if they have 2 Patriot things, she can get rid of 1, and that does help you go big enough. So I think High Evolutionary wanting you to soak energy at the end of turns makes Rogue's 3-cost a real actual upside in a way that it isn't in a lot of other archetypes. So if you wanted to play Rogue, I would start here, I think. I would try to find a reason to play the card, right? Where is there an ongoing ability that I want to steal really badly, and that I get benefit from playing this card instead of Enchantress? So this is where I ended up in terms of, like, if I really wanted to play Rogue, what would the home be? I think Rogue could end up being a major player, honestly. Like, I always kind of thought she was okay, but it was always just safer to run Enchantress. It was easier to splash, but now I feel like for the first time, there's a real legitimate good reason to run her. Probably for the first time since the beta Mr. Negative decks, where, like, the reason to run her was that she would get rid of their Iron Man in the mirror, right? And you would get that Iron Man, and she would only cost 1. Like, probably for the first time since then, I think there's a really, really, really good reason to run her. And I guess, you know, people are going to get mad at me and be like, oh, you should have run Rogue in Silver Surfer. But for some reason, it always just was, like, just 1 card off when Silver Surfer was good. And when Silver Surfer was bad, I didn't play much Silver Surfer anyway. So I think if you want to be playing decks with these OTA cards, these 3 are the lists I would start with. If you want to just be playing normal decks, I honestly don't know that much changed. Like, things got a little bit stronger and a little bit weaker, but I don't necessarily think this is going to result in, like, anything meta breaking. What'll result in that, I mean, hopefully, is the patch that's going to be happening next Tuesday. So overall, I think this was a very solid OTA. Nothing that I came out of here thinking, wow, why would they ever do that? Nothing that's going to ruin the game. Just pretty solid changes. Just toning down decks that were probably power outliers and giving some boosts to cards that really needed it in the form of Rogue and Medusa. Of those 2, Rogue is the one I like the most, but I'm interested to see if Medusa can jump out of that Star-Lord tier and maybe make it up to Lizard and Jeff tier. I'm interested to see how that goes. What was your favorite of these changes from the OTAs? Let me know in the comments below. Do you think I missed something? Let me know, because I am a sicko and I read every single one of these comments. So I will see you in the next one. As always, I've been KM Best. Catch you later.